The moment I met Luca, I felt a tug of something unfamiliar. A crack in the solid walls I had spent years building around myself. Working as the head chef of one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants, I'd always kept my passions contained within the kitchen, poured them into the food I created, and let them simmer away from my personal life. My husband James was stable, predictable, a banker with a calm temperament who provided me with everything I thought I needed. But Luca's presence awakened a craving in me I hadn't felt in years. It was like the smell of vanilla just before it's added to a simmering sauce, sweet and heavy with promise. Luca was a new supplier, specializing in rare, exotic ingredients. I had been skeptical at first. People claimed all sorts of things to get their products in our restaurant, but as soon as he brought in his first batch of Peruvian wild cacao beans, I knew he was different. His eyes were as intense as the flavors he promised, dark and full of unspoken secrets. When he placed the beans on the counter, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary, I felt my breath hitch, a slight, almost imperceptible shift. It was subtle, like a quiet, secret whisper that only I could hear. And yet, I ignored it, tried to convince myself it was nothing more than professional excitement. But each time he visited, bringing fruits that burst with flavors I could barely describe, spices that left my tongue tingling long after he'd left, I felt the weight of temptation pressing down on me. We would discuss the texture of a particular wild honey or debate the origins of a saffron strain, each conversation inching closer, each discussion more laden with unspoken desire. His voice was warm, steady, and full of a quiet confidence that made me feel both vulnerable and invincible. When he spoke, it was as if no one else existed, his eyes piercing through the noise and chaos of the kitchen straight to me. Our connection began, innocently enough, over a project to craft a limited seasonal menu. Luca offered to bring a rare Chilean pepper that I had only read about in culinary journals. I invited him to join me in the test kitchen, and the first night we stayed well past closing, slicing, searing, tasting, our hands grazing as we reached for the same tools, our laughter echoing in the quiet room. I felt like a younger version of myself, unburdened by responsibility and loyalty, as though the evening air had been seasoned with something electric. That night, as we finished the final dish, a delicate ceviche laced with his special pepper and topped with his own collection of hand-harvested sea salt, he held my gaze a moment too long. I could feel the unspoken question in his eyes, a dare that I was too afraid to acknowledge. I remember the way his fingers brushed mine as he handed me a spoon for the tasting, a simple gesture that sent shivers down my spine. The ceviche was perfect, balanced and brimming with heat, but it was nothing compared to the fire building between us. I went home that night, my mind racing, my pulse thrumming, the taste of the dish still lingering on my tongue. James greeted me, his steady presence both comforting and stifling. He asked about my day, and as I recounted the events, I could feel the words growing hollow, an aching emptiness in every sentence. I realized then that I had been starving for something deeper, something raw and untamed, something Luca had stirred awake with nothing more than a look and a touch. The following week we had another tasting, this time working with an obscure Asian fruit Luca had sourced specifically for me. The night blurred with laughter, our banter quick and effortless. His confidence was intoxicating, each movement purposeful, each glance loaded. And then in a quiet moment, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His hand lingered, tracing a soft line along my cheek. I could feel my pulse pounding, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into his touch, my breath catching as his lips brushed mine. The kiss was hesitant at first, almost unsure, but as his arms wrapped around me, I felt the floodgates open. It was like tasting the perfect reduction sauce after hours of simmering, rich, layered, and deeply satisfying. His hands explored the curves of my back, each touch igniting something primal within me, a hunger I hadn't known I possessed. I felt his heartbeat against mine, a rhythm that drowned out the quiet hum of the kitchen appliances, the world fading into nothing more than the heat between us. Over the next few weeks, our affair unfolded in stolen moments, secret glances, and hurried touches. We would meet in the quiet hours of the night, hidden away in the test kitchen or a secluded corner of the storage room, our whispered conversations blending with the scent of fresh basil and warm vanilla. Each encounter felt like a forbidden indulgence, a step deeper into a world I knew I shouldn't be exploring. But each time I told myself it was the last, I found myself drawn back, intoxicated by the taste of him, The way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. I would return home to James, guilt eating away at me as I prepared our dinner, my hands moving automatically as my mind drifted back to Luca. My husband would talk about his day, and I would nod, smile, play the role of the devoted wife, all while replaying the moments I had shared with another man just hours before. It was a dangerous game, one that left me breathless and terrified, but I couldn't stop. Luca had become the flavor I craved, the spice that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. Then came the night that everything changed. Luca brought in a case of the rarest truffles, their earthy aroma filling the kitchen, and as we worked late into the night perfecting the dish, he leaned in, his lips brushing against my neck, his breath warm against my skin. I knew in that moment that we had crossed a line, that there was no going back. Our passion was raw, unfiltered. Each kiss an affirmation of the unspoken bond we had built over months of collaboration and silent longing. But with each touch, each whispered confession, the weight of my choices bore down on me. I loved James in a way, he was my anchor, my constant. But Luca was my storm, my fire. The forbidden fruit I could never fully possess yet couldn't resist tasting again and again. I knew I was on borrowed time, that the delicate balance I had managed to keep would soon come crashing down. But in Luca's arms, under the dim lights of the empty kitchen, I didn't care. Our affair ended as quietly as it began. Not with a dramatic confrontation but with a silent understanding. Luca brought in his last shipment, his eyes lingering on mine as he handed over the invoice. I felt a pang of longing, an ache that would remain long after he was gone. And as he walked away, I knew I had tasted something I could never replace, an experience as fleeting and exquisite as the flavors we had shared. I returned home that night, the weight of my choices pressing down on me as I sat at the dinner table with James. He looked at me, his eyes filled with the quiet love I had taken for granted, and I felt a pang of guilt twist in my stomach. I knew that I had crossed a line, tasted the forbidden, and while I could never take it back, I also knew that Luca had left an indelible mark on my soul. A taste of the wild, untamed freedom I had always yearned for, hidden beneath the pristine surface of my carefully curated life. I thought the ache would fade with time, that I could bury it beneath the routine of daily life, but the void left by Luca lingered like a whisper at the back of my mind, an unsatisfied hunger that gnawed at me. I returned to the kitchen each day, telling myself I could refocus, find solace in the very thing that had brought us together, my love for cooking. I thought I could channel the same intensity into my work, craft dishes that would distract me, pour my passion into new flavors and textures. But with each creation, each ingredient I touched, I felt Luca's presence like a ghost beside me, an invisible shadow reminding me of everything I had lost, and everything I had found. James was as steady as ever, attentive but never questioning the subtle changes in me. His gaze would drift over me, his expression curious, perhaps noticing the slight tremor in my hands as I prepared our dinners, the distracted way I replied to his questions. And yet he never pressed me. I don't know if he sensed the distance growing between us or if he chose not to acknowledge it, but part of me resented his quiet acceptance, his willingness to overlook the signs that should have been clear. I longed for him to notice, to question me, to pull me back from the edge, but instead, his silence became an invitation for my thoughts to wander back to Luca. The restaurant was my only reprieve. Behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, I could mask my turmoil with a perfect facade, hiding my heartache behind the discipline of my craft. I threw myself into creating new menus, ordering rare ingredients, sourcing flavors that reminded me of Luca's visits. I knew I was playing with fire, that these reminders would only keep my feelings alive, but I couldn't help myself. Every truffle, every exotic pepper, every hint of spice carried a memory, and I found myself savoring the pain as much as I had once savored the taste of his lips. My staff noticed the change. They whispered, casting curious glances as I worked later and later into the night, obsessing over dishes that didn't require perfection, adjusting seasonings until every note was flawless. I told myself I was only trying to maintain the restaurant's reputation, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was chasing something that could never be replicated, trying to capture the feeling Luca had ignited within me. One evening, as I finished a particularly intricate dessert, I caught sight of a familiar face through the kitchen door, Luca. My breath caught, my heart hammering in my chest as I watched him sit at a corner table, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on me. The world seemed to blur, every sound fading as I felt the pull of his presence once again. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward him, my mind racing with 1,000 unspoken words. "Luca," I whispered, barely able to contain the tremor in my voice as I stood beside his table. His gaze was intense, searching my face with a mixture of regret and longing that mirrored my own. "I had to see you," he murmured, his voice low, a hint of vulnerability slipping through the confident mask he usually wore. I told myself I wouldn't come back, but I didn't need him to finish. I knew exactly what he meant, felt the same restless pull that had driven me back to thoughts of him, to the memories we had created together. We sat there in silence, the tension between us as palpable as it had been that first night in the test kitchen. My fingers twitched, aching to reach across the table, to feel the warmth of his hand beneath mine, but I held back, my gaze dropping to the empty space between us. "I miss," he hesitated, his voice trailing off, and I looked up, meeting his eyes as he struggled to find the words. "I miss working with you. I miss what we had." My heart twisted painfully, and I forced myself to smile, knowing that nothing I said could change the reality of our situation. I had chosen my life with James, had returned to my routines, my responsibilities, but the emptiness I felt in Luca's absence reminded me of everything I had sacrificed. "Luca, you know we can't go back." My voice broke slightly and I took a shaky breath, trying to regain my composure. "It was beautiful, but it has to stay in the past." He nodded, his expression unreadable, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes, a flicker of the same pain I felt deep within. And yet, as he rose to leave, his hand brushed mine, a final lingering touch that reignited every spark I had tried so hard to extinguish. For weeks after that encounter, I walked through life in a daze, caught between the memory of Luca's touch and the reality of my life with James. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, every routine hollow, every smile forced. James continued to be patient, his love steady and unwavering, and the guilt weighed on me like an anchor, pulling me deeper into a sea of self-doubt and regret. But one night, as I prepared dinner for James, I realized I couldn't keep living this way. The food felt tasteless, the kitchen cold and lifeless, and for the first time, I felt the weight of my own discontent pressing down on me, suffocating me. I needed to make a choice, to finally close the chapter with Luca and commit fully to the life I had built with James, or to acknowledge the truth that I had buried for so long, that I could never truly be happy without the fire and passion that Luca had awakened within me. As I set the table, James walked in, his smile warm but tinged with worry as he looked at me. He reached out, his hand brushing mine, and I felt a surge of affection mixed with a pang of regret. He deserved more than a wife haunted by another man's memory, more than a love that was half-hearted and distant. "James," I whispered, my voice barely audible as I looked into his eyes. "I need to tell you something." He froze, his expression unreadable, but I could see the fear lurking beneath the surface, a silent understanding of what was about to unfold. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my choices, the pain of the past months, and the bittersweet ache of everything I was about to lose. In that moment, I knew there was no going back, that the taste of forbidden fruit had forever changed me, leaving me with a hunger that could never be satisfied by anything else. And as I spoke the words that would shatter the life we had built together, I felt a strange sense of relief, a freedom I hadn't known I was missing, a taste of the life I had always craved, waiting just beyond the edge of everything I had once believed in. James's face didn't change immediately as I confessed everything. There was a moment where he seemed to drift somewhere far away, eyes unfocused, his hand still resting on the edge of the table, motionless. Then he pulled his hand back, his lips pressing into a tight line. I could almost hear his mind whirling, his thoughts racing through the things I had just said, trying to make sense of it all. I wanted him to yell, to scream at me, to demand an explanation or an excuse. Anything that would give me the release I craved, something to shatter the icy grip of guilt and regret that had taken root inside me. But James just looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I had never seen before, a vulnerability that twisted the knife even deeper. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. I felt my own voice catch, the weight of the question hitting me like a punch. There was no easy answer, no simple way to summarize what Luca had become to me. How he had seeped into my life, my thoughts, and my heart. It was months, but it felt like years, an eternity wrapped in stolen moments and secret glances, all of it compressed into a bittersweet ache that I couldn't shake. Since the new menu project started, I replied, unable to meet his eyes. I don't know how it happened, James. I tried to stop it, but I couldn't. He exhaled slowly, a sound heavy with defeat, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something break in him. I knew this wasn't just a confession of a few nights spent with another man. It was the admission that I had found something with Luca that I had never found with him, a passion that James and I had lost somewhere along the way. I had let someone else touch a part of me that he had never reached, and that betrayal ran deeper than anything physical. And do you love him? He asked, his tone softer than I expected. The question lingered between us, and I felt a hot tear slip down my cheek as I struggled to answer. Love was such a complicated word, something that couldn't encapsulate the whirlwind of emotions I felt. Luca had stirred something in me that was raw and visceral, but it wasn't the steady, enduring love that James represented. What I felt for Luca was fire, unpredictable and dangerous, but it wasn't the love that built a life. I don't know, I whispered, feeling the uncertainty of my own answer. It's not the same, not like with you. With Luca it was different. James nodded slowly, and I could see him piecing together his own answer from my words. We sat in silence, the weight of the confession settling between us, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts, each of us wondering what the next step would be. I half expected him to tell me to leave, to tell me he needed time or that we couldn't continue. But James surprised me. I can forgive this, he said finally, his voice rough but steady. If you still want this life with me, if you want to try, I can forgive you. His words broke something in me, unleashing a torrent of emotions I had been holding back. I felt myself shaking as I realized what he was offering. A way back, a chance to rebuild, to find something between us that had been lost. And yet, as I looked at him, the guilt twisting in my gut, I realized I wasn't sure if I deserved that forgiveness, or if I could truly accept it. James, I don't know if I can just move on. I feel like I lost a part of myself, like I'm not the same person anymore. I said, my voice cracking. I thought I wanted stability, but then Luca. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long. James clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed my words, the honesty that was both painful and necessary. He stood up slowly, pacing to the window, his back turned to me as he tried to process everything. I knew I was hurting him even more by confessing this, by admitting that he hadn't been enough, that our life together had left something inside me unfulfilled. But the truth was a bitter pill, and I couldn't keep hiding it, not after all that had happened. You're saying I don't make you feel alive? He muttered, more to himself than to me. It's not about you, I replied quickly, feeling the desperation in my voice. It's about me, James. Something in me changed, and I don't know how to go back to the way things were. He turned around, his face set in a hard line, and I saw the frustration boiling beneath his calm exterior. He was a man who had built his life around predictability, around security, and I had disrupted that with my own restlessness, my own selfish need for something more. I knew I was asking for something he couldn't understand, something that felt like betrayal in its rawest form, but I couldn't take it back. The taste of that forbidden life had lingered on my tongue too long, and it had poisoned my sense of what was possible. Then maybe you should go, he said finally, his voice cold but resolute. If you can't see a future with me, if this isn't enough for you, then maybe you need to figure out what it is you really want. The words hung in the air, final and absolute, and I felt my heart drop as the reality of his ultimatum sank in. He wasn't asking me to stay anymore. He was giving me the choice, telling me to decide between the life we had built and the unknown path that Luca represented. And I knew I couldn't keep straddling that line, torn between two worlds that could never coexist. I packed my things that night, each item a painful reminder of the life I was leaving behind. The apartment felt colder, emptier, as I moved through the rooms, collecting pieces of my life, wondering if I would ever find the same comfort again. James stayed in the living room, his gaze fixed on the floor, his silence a painful reminder of everything we had lost. I wanted to reach out to tell him that I was sorry, that I wished I could be the person he deserved, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. As I closed the door behind me, the weight of my decision settled in, a hollow ache that echoed in the quiet hallway. I had chosen freedom, passion, the unknown, and I had no idea if I would ever find what I was searching for. But I knew I couldn't keep living a life that left me feeling empty, caught between duty and desire, trapped in a marriage that felt like a cage. In the weeks that followed, I drifted through life in a haze, adjusting to the new reality I had created for myself. Luca was gone, traveling abroad for a new venture, his absence as painful as his presence had once been intoxicating. I had hoped that leaving James would bring me closer to the freedom I craved, but instead I found myself lost, adrift in a world that no longer felt familiar. I immersed myself in work, spending endless hours in the kitchen, hoping the rhythm of chopping and stirring would fill the emptiness that had settled inside me. But no matter how many dishes I created, how many flavors I explored, I couldn't escape the feeling that I had left a part of myself behind, that I had sacrificed something precious in my pursuit of passion. Months passed, and I heard from James only once, a short, formal message asking about a few belongings I had left behind. The cold politeness of his words cut deep, reminding me of the warmth I had lost, the quiet love that had once been mine. I wondered if he had moved on, if he had found someone who could give him the stability I never could, but I pushed the thought away, unwilling to confront the jealousy that gnawed at me. One evening, as I closed up the restaurant, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass door, and for the first time I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She looked tired, haunted, a stranger weighed down by regrets and choices that couldn't be undone. I realized then that I had been chasing something that might never truly satisfy me, that I had sacrificed a love that was real for a passion that had faded as quickly as it had ignited. And in that moment I knew what I had to do. I returned to James's apartment that night, standing outside the door, my heart pounding as I gathered the courage to knock. I didn't know what I would say, didn't know if he would even want to see me, but I knew that I couldn't live with the silence, the distance that had grown between us. I had to find a way to rebuild what we had lost, to see if there was any part of our love that could be salvaged. When the door opened, James stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and wariness. We stood in silence for a moment, each of us caught in the weight of the past, the choices we had made, the pain we had caused each other. "James," I whispered, my voice trembling. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. For everything." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he looked at me, and I felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, tentative chance that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other. "I know," he said quietly, his voice filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "But sometimes sorry isn't enough." And as the door closed softly between us, I felt the finality of his words, the weight of a love that had slipped through my fingers, leaving me with nothing but memories of a life I could never truly recapture. Standing alone outside James's door, I felt an emptiness settle over me that was colder than anything I had ever known. It wasn't just regret. It was the hollow knowledge that I had burned bridges I could never rebuild, chasing something I thought would fill a void, only to find myself more lost than ever. I thought leaving James would bring freedom, that giving in to my passions with Luca would satisfy some deep hunger I could never articulate. But now, as I walked back to my empty apartment, every footstep echoed with a quiet, haunting reminder of what I had lost. The next few days passed in a fog. I threw myself into work, pushing harder than I ever had before. I took on projects I might have avoided in the past, new menus, ambitious collaborations, private dining experiences for high-profile clients. Each dish I created was like an attempt to rebuild a part of myself, to find the same satisfaction I had once found in cooking before it all became tangled with memories of Luca. My staff noticed, of course. They watched as I stayed late every night, perfecting dishes long after the last customers had left, my hands moving mechanically while my mind wandered to the life I had walked away from. Weeks turned into months, and slowly life began to feel almost normal again. Almost. I was still haunted by the choices I had made, but I learned to live with the ache, to tuck it away, burying it beneath the demands of the kitchen. It was easier, I told myself, to focus on work, to let the hum of the restaurant and the rhythm of chopping and searing drown out everything else. It wasn't the life I had imagined for myself, but it was something. One evening, as I was plating a particularly intricate dish, a rich duck confit with a reduction sauce I'd spent hours perfecting, my sous chef Emily came up to me, her face a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice hesitant. I wiped my hands on my apron, half expecting it to be a food critic or a demanding VIP customer. But when I walked out into the dining room, I froze. There, standing by the entrance, was Luca. His hair was a little longer, his face slightly more weathered, but his eyes held that same intense, knowing gaze that had once made my heart race. He looked at me with a warmth that melted through the walls I had built around myself, and in that instant, the months we had spent apart vanished, as if they were nothing more than a distant memory. "Luca," I whispered, feeling a rush of emotions I had tried so hard to suppress. "Hello, Claire," he said, his voice soft. His eyes filled with an understanding that was both comforting and disarming. He looked around the restaurant, his gaze lingering on the tables, the ambience, and finally back on me. "You've done well here. It's incredible." The compliment caught me off guard. I had become used to praise from critics and patrons, but hearing it from him felt different, felt personal, vulnerable. I nodded, swallowing hard, unsure of what to say, the emotions tangling inside me. What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Luca took a step closer, his hands slipping into his pockets as he searched my face. "I thought I'd come back to New York, see some familiar places, and I wanted to see you. To talk." The quiet sincerity in his voice tugged at something inside me, a part of me that I had tried to bury. I glanced around the restaurant, catching the curious glances from my staff, the customers, but I knew that if I turned him away now, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had just listened. "Let's go somewhere quieter," I said, leading him out of the restaurant and into the cool night air. We walked in silence, our footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalk until we reached a small park, its trees casting soft shadows beneath the streetlights. I felt a familiar rush of excitement mixed with dread, the memories of our time together flooding back. We sat on a bench, the quietness of the park a stark contrast to the noise that had filled my life these past months. Luca looked at me, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of everything that had happened between us. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally, his voice filled with a raw honesty, "for leaving the way I did. I thought putting distance between us would make things easier. But it didn't. I couldn't stop thinking about you, Claire." His words hit me like a wave, bringing back memories of our nights in the test kitchen. The stolen moments, the laughter and intensity that had once filled every corner of my life. Part of me wanted to reach out, to feel his touch again, to relive that thrill, but I knew the cost. I knew what it had done to me, to James, to everything I had once believed in. "I couldn't stop thinking about you either," I admitted, my voice shaky, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. "But I can't, Luca, I can't go back to that. It destroyed me. It destroyed my marriage." Luca looked down, nodding slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the bench. "I know. I didn't come back to reopen old wounds, Claire. I just needed to see you, to know if what we had was real, or if it was just a beautiful, painful mistake." I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, the reality of his words settling over me. It was real. It had been the most intense, passionate connection I had ever known, but it had come at a price I wasn't sure I was willing to pay again. "Maybe it was both," I whispered, the admission pulling something deep within me, raw and aching. "It was real, but it also hurt too much." He nodded, his gaze softening as he reached out, his hand covering mine. His touch was warm, familiar, and for a moment I let myself bask in it, in the feeling of connection that had been missing from my life. But as his fingers brushed mine, I knew this couldn't last. We were both chasing something fleeting, a moment that had passed, and clinging to it would only bring more pain. "I'm glad you came back," I said, pulling my hand away, feeling a bittersweet sense of closure. "But I think I need to let go of this, of us. I need to find a way to move forward, to make peace with my choices." Luca nodded, his gaze filled with understanding, and I saw the same mixture of sadness and acceptance that mirrored my own. He stood up, offering me a small bittersweet smile, and in that moment I knew that this was goodbye, not just to him but to everything we had once been. As he walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the city, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, a quiet acceptance that replaced the turmoil that had consumed me for so long. It was as if I had finally closed a chapter one had been afraid to end, and though the ache would remain, I knew it was something I could live with, something I could carry without letting it define me. In the weeks that followed, I found myself focusing on my work in a new way, not as a distraction, but as a true expression of who I was. I began experimenting with flavors again, not because they reminded me of Luca, but because they reminded me of my own passion, the love for my craft that had been there long before him. Slowly, I found my way back to myself, to the woman I had been before I had lost myself in the thrill of the forbidden. And though there were still nights when I would lie awake, haunted by memories, by the choices I had made, I felt a quiet peace knowing that I had lived, that I had tasted the wild, intoxicating thrill of passion and had come out on the other side, scarred but stronger. I knew I could never return to the life I had before, but I could build something new, something honest and true, a life that was fully mine. As the seasons changed, I found myself letting go, bit by bit, of the past. The memories softened, the pain faded, and I was left with a quiet strength, a resilience born from the mistakes I had made and the lessons I had learned. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it, to embrace the uncertainty with open arms. And as I stepped into my kitchen each day, the familiar scent of spices and herbs filling the air, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. No longer searching, no longer yearning for something out of reach, but finally at peace with the life I had chosen and the woman I had become. Life settled into a steady rhythm after that, but it was a different kind of rhythm, a deeper, quieter one. My world had changed subtly, like a new seasoning in a familiar dish. I had learned to appreciate solitude in ways I never had before, and it wasn't the desperate loneliness I had once feared. It was softer, more like an old cherished recipe, familiar yet comforting in its simplicity. I threw myself into my craft with a newfound intensity, but not with the frenzy that had once driven me. My passion for cooking felt like it had matured, shifted, softened around the edges. Each dish I created, each flavor I tasted, felt richer, layered with the complexities of everything I had experienced, like a sauce that had been simmered for hours, infused with 1,000 ingredients. At the restaurant, I became known for my meticulous attention to detail, my insistence on the finest ingredients, my ability to transform a simple meal into an unforgettable experience. Patrons began asking for me by name, wanting to know who was behind the flavors they tasted, and my heart swelled with pride each time I saw a satisfied smile. It wasn't the rush of passion, the heat of forbidden moments. It was something steadier, something that built slowly over time. In those months I met new people. Chefs, critics, restaurateurs who shared my passion for food. And while I often felt the stirrings of attraction, I found myself holding back, reluctant to dive into anything that might stir up the chaos I had fought so hard to put behind me. I was no longer the woman who would throw herself headfirst into something reckless. I had learned that passion, while beautiful, was a flame that could consume if left unchecked. I needed something balanced, a love that complemented my life rather than consuming it. And then one rainy afternoon, a woman walked into the restaurant for a private dining experience with a small group of friends. Her name was Sarah, and she was an editor for a prominent culinary magazine. She had that rare, calm energy, the kind that fills a room without overwhelming it. I noticed her even before I knew her name. She sat at the head of the table, her laugh soft but genuine, her eyes bright with curiosity as each dish was brought out. After the meal, she asked to speak with me. I felt a twinge of nerves as I approached her, unsure of what to expect. But she looked up at me with warmth in her eyes, extending her hand. "Claire," she said, her voice smooth and warm. "I don't think I've ever had a meal quite like this." Each dish felt like a story. I felt myself blush, unused to such direct praise, especially from someone with her credentials. "Thank you," I replied, my voice a little unsteady. "That means a lot coming from someone like you." We chatted for a while, our conversation flowing naturally, and I found myself surprisingly at ease with her. She was different from anyone I had met before. Grounded, insightful, her questions probing but never invasive. She asked about my inspirations, the flavors that guided me, the philosophies that shaped my approach to food. Her eyes lit up when I talked about my love for simplicity, for letting ingredients speak for themselves, and she listened with an attentiveness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. At the end of our conversation, She offered me her card, suggesting we meet again to discuss a potential feature for the magazine. I accepted, feeling a rush of excitement tempered by a cautiousness I had grown used to. I wasn't looking for romance, I reminded myself. I was content, focused on my work, at peace with the solitude I had found. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the memory of her smile, the way she had looked at me with such genuine curiosity. I found myself glancing at her card more than once, the anticipation growing each time. When she reached out a week later to set up a meeting, I didn't hesitate. Our first few meetings were purely professional, filled with discussions of food trends, stories of our experiences in the culinary world, shared laughter over bizarre encounters we'd had with clients and critics alike. But with each encounter, I felt a connection growing, something subtle yet undeniable, like the way a delicate spice slowly infuses into a broth, becoming an inseparable part of its flavor. It was during one of these meetings, over a coffee that had long gone cold, that Sarah looked at me, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "Claire," she began softly, her gaze dropping to her hands before meeting mine. "I hope I'm not overstepping, but I feel like there's something more here. Something between us that's not just professional." Her honesty caught me off guard, but I felt a strange warm relief wash over me. I had been wrestling with the same thoughts, but I hadn't dared to voice them, unsure if I was ready to open myself up again, to risk the hurt and chaos that love had once brought into my life. I nodded slowly, feeling the tension ease from my shoulders. "I've been feeling the same way," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to know that I'm a little broken. I've been through things that have changed me, and I'm not the same person I was a year ago." She reached across the table, her hand covering mine in a gentle, reassuring touch. "We're all a little broken, Claire. It's the cracks that let the light in, right?" Her words struck a chord, something that resonated deeply, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek, the vulnerability of the moment overwhelming me. Sarah didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she squeezed it gently, her warmth steady and comforting. In that moment, I felt something shift, a quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to keep punishing myself for the mistakes I had made. I could allow myself to feel again, to trust, to open up to the possibility of something new. From that moment on, Sarah became a part of my life slowly but surely. She was patient, understanding, never pushing me beyond what I was ready for. Our connection deepened over time, a slow and steady warmth that was the exact opposite of the intensity one had once shared with Luca. With Sarah, I didn't feel the dizzying thrill of passion or the weight of temptation. Instead, I felt a steady joy, a quiet contentment that grew with every shared moment, every lingering look, every whispered conversation. She brought out parts of me I hadn't known existed, gentler, softer sides that had been overshadowed by ambition and drive for so long. She taught me to appreciate the quieter moments, to savor the simplicity of a shared meal, a walk in the park, a morning coffee sipped in comfortable silence. With her, I felt whole, seen, accepted, even with my flaws and scars. Our relationship grew in the background of my work, a steady presence that filled my life with a warmth I hadn't known I needed. And over time, I found myself letting go of the past, of the guilt and shame that had once weighed so heavily on me. I stopped punishing myself for what had happened with James and Luca, choosing instead to learn from it, to let it shape me into someone stronger, someone more self-aware. Sarah and I built a life together, one filled with laughter and love, but also with the respect and understanding that came from our shared histories, our scars. She became my partner not just in life but in my journey of healing, someone who stood by me as I confronted my fears, my insecurities, and my lingering doubts. Years passed and the memories of my time with James and Luca softened, becoming distant echoes of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. I knew I would never forget them, nor the lessons they had taught me, but I had found something more lasting, a love that was rooted in patience, understanding, and a quiet, steadfast commitment. And as I looked back on my journey, the choices I had made, the mistakes, the heartbreaks, I realized that every step had led me here, to a life that was truly mine, a life that was whole and complete in ways I had never imagined. In the end, I had found the freedom I had always yearned for, not in the thrill of the forbidden or the rush of passion, but in the quiet certainty of a love that allowed me to be fully, unapologetically myself. And that, I knew, was the most precious gift of all. As the years unfolded, I found peace in the life Sarah and I built together. Our days filled with the quiet warmth of shared routines, the small joys of knowing each other in the most mundane ways. I learned to let go of my need for constant excitement, for the fire that had once drawn me into the storm. I realized that true fulfillment lay in the simple, enduring moments, in the presence of someone who loved me with a quiet depth that didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Every now and then, a memory of James would drift into my mind, or I'd catch a faint whiff of a familiar spice that would remind me of Luca. But instead of regret, I felt a gentle kind of acceptance. I'd carry those memories as one carries old, well-worn photographs in a drawer, not to relive them, but to remember the person I had been and the lessons those moments had taught me. They were a part of me, woven into the fabric of my life, shaping who I had become. In time, Sarah and I started a new project together. A small, cozy restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was nothing extravagant, nothing like the fast-paced, high-pressure world I had once thrived in. Instead, it was intimate, with only a handful of tables, a place where I could focus on each dish, pour my heart into every flavor, and share meals with people who came for the experience, for the connection. We called it the Gathering Table, a name that felt fitting for the life we had created. A place where people could come together, share their stories, and find warmth in each other's company. It was my sanctuary, a space where my love for cooking could flourish without the noise of my past. Every evening as Sarah worked the front of house, greeting our guests with her warm smile, I would look at her and feel a deep sense of gratitude. In those moments, I understood that life isn't about finding that one perfect path or getting everything right the first time. It's about growth, resilience, and the courage to face yourself, even when it hurts. I had walked through fire, tasted the forbidden, and emerged on the other side stronger, softer, and finally at peace with the person I had become. And so each night as I prepared the final dish, watching Sarah laugh with the guests, I felt a quiet joy settle in my chest, a steady warmth that filled every corner of my heart. I had found my way, not to the life I had once planned, but to the life I was meant to live. I had found my home, my haven, my gathering place. And for the first time in my life, I knew that I was exactly where I belonged.